Chapter 4. The Convergence. Establishing infinite consciousness as the necessary and uncaused ultimate subject. 8. Infinite consciousness as the uncaused ultimate subject. 8.1. The Convergence Point. The preceding sections have built the argument of this book through two complementary movements. The first movement, chapters 1 and 2, established through exhaustive elimination that the subject of experience cannot be located in any part of any system at any scale of reality, and that the ground of physical reality is not inert matter, but an informational, energetic, and ultimately conscious field within which all apparent matter arises as a surface encoding of creative activity. The second movement, chapter 3, established through the ontological psychology within the framework of Wadat al-Kayal that the human person has a precise four-layered architecture of selfhood, with the dominant self as the immediate channel through which infinite consciousness experiences every psychological act, and the real self as the interface between the person and the infinite ground. These two movements now converge on a single question that the book has been building toward from its first sentence. What is the ultimate subject of all experience? An immediate, structural answer has already been given. Whatever is experienced through the dominant self, the specific configuration in which the person primarily resides at any given moment. But the dominant self is not itself the subject. It is a localized channel, and identifying it only tells us through what a given experience occurs, not who undergoes it. That channel operates within an architecture that extends beyond the person to the boundary with infinite consciousness through the real self. And it is at that boundary, not within the dominant self, that the question of the subject must ultimately be resolved. The ultimate answer requires identifying what lies beyond that boundary, the ground within which the person exists as a localized thought, the consciousness within which the real self participates, the subject that is never itself an object, the feeler that is never itself felt by another. The present section establishes that ultimate answer through three converging arguments: the experiential regress argument, the causal regress argument, and the convergence argument that draws together all independent lines of evidence from the preceding sections. Each argument reaches the same conclusion by a different logical route. Their convergence is not merely rhetorical reinforcement. It is evidence of a different kind from any single argument. When independent lines of inquiry reaching the same conclusion from completely different starting points, the probability that the conclusion is correct approaches certainty by a logical principle that philosophers have called inference to the best explanation and scientists have called convergent validity. 8.2. The experiential regress argument. The experiential regress argument begins from the undeniable fact of experience. Experience exists. This is the one claim that cannot be coherently denied, because the denial of experience is itself an experience performed by a subject, and therefore confirms the existence of experience in the very act of attempting to deny it. Descartes was right about this much. The cogito, the fact of thinking and therefore of experiencing, is the most certain fact available to any inquirer. If experience exists, it requires a subject. Experience is always experience for someone or something. There is no such thing as experience in the abstract, experience without a perspective, experience that occurs without anyone undergoing it. The very concept of experience entails a subject. something for which the experience is undergone, from whose perspective the experience has the character it has, in whose awareness the experience arises and passes. This is what Nagel, 1974, meant when he argued that experience has an irreducibly first-person character. Experience is always experience from somewhere, from a particular vantage point that is the subject's own. If experience requires a subject, then every localized subject of experience is either itself the ultimate subject or requires a ground beyond itself that is the ultimate subject. A localized subject is one that exists within a larger context, that came into existence at some point, that depends for its existence on conditions beyond itself, and that will cease to exist when those conditions are no longer met. The human person is a localized subject in precisely this sense. It came into existence. It depends on biological, psychological, and ontological conditions for its continued existence, and it will cease in its current form when those conditions are dissolved. A localized subject is therefore a contingent subject. It exists, but might not have existed. It experiences, but might not have experienced. It is the subject of its experience, but only contingently so. A contingent subject requires a ground. It requires something that accounts for its existence and its experiential character, something that is the condition of its being a subject rather than not being a subject. If that ground is itself a contingent subject, it requires its own ground, and the regress continues. The regress of contingent subjects cannot continue indefinitely for the same reason that the regress of contingent causes cannot continue indefinitely. An infinite regress of contingent subjects does not account for any of them, because each member of the series is as much in need of explanation as every other. The regress must terminate in a necessary subject, a subject whose existence is not contingent, whose experiential character does not depend on conditions beyond itself, whose being as a subject is self-grounding rather than derived from something outside itself. This necessary subject, the subject that terminates the experiential regress, must have specific properties that follow logically from its necessity. It cannot have begun to exist, because if it began it was caused, and if caused it is contingent rather than necessary. It cannot cease to exist, for the same reason. It cannot be located within any system as a component, because components are contingent on the whole that contains them. It cannot be limited by space or time, because spatial and temporal limitations are conditions imposed from outside, and a necessary subject cannot be conditioned from outside. It must be the ground of all contingent subjects rather than one contingent subject among others. And it must be the continuous sustaining condition of all experience at every moment, not merely the initiating condition that started the chain of experience at some point in the past. These properties are precisely the properties that the philosophical and theological traditions have attributed to what the present book calls infinite consciousness. Infinite consciousness is not contingent. It does not begin or end. It is not located within any system. It is not limited by space or time. It is the ground of all contingent beings rather than one contingent being among others. And it is the continuous sustaining condition of all experience at every moment. The experiential regress argument does not merely point toward infinite consciousness as one possible candidate for the ultimate subject. It demonstrates that a necessary subject with precisely these properties is logically required by the existence of experience, and that infinite consciousness is the only candidate that satisfies all the logical requirements simultaneously. The relationship between the dominant self, the real self, and infinite consciousness is now precisely statable in terms of this argument. The dominant self is a contingent channel, not a subject in any sense. It exists within the person, depends on the person's continued existence, and shifts continuously as the person's circumstances change, determining the quality of experience without ever being the one who undergoes it. The real self is the least contingent dimension of the person's selfhood. It exists at the boundary with infinite consciousness, participates most directly in the necessary ground, and is above the spatial, temporal, and physical limitations that constrain the other selves. But even the real self is not itself the necessary subject. It is the most transparent interface between the contingent person and the necessary ground. Infinite consciousness is the necessary subject within which the real self participates, through which the real self connects the contingent person to the unconditioned ground of all experience. 8.3. The causal regress argument. The causal regress argument approaches the same conclusion from the direction of physical causation rather than experiential subjectivity. It establishes that the same logical structure that requires a necessary subject at the terminus of the experiential regress also requires a necessary cause at the terminus of the physical causal chain, and that these two termini are not two different realities, but two aspects of the same ultimate ground. The principle of sufficient reason, formulated by Leibniz 1714, and recognized across philosophical traditions as a fundamental constraint on adequate explanation, holds that everything that exists has a sufficient reason or cause for its existence. Applied to the chain of physical causation, this principle generates an immediate and well-known logical problem. If every physical event is caused by a prior physical event, and every prior physical event is caused by a still earlier physical event, the chain of causation extends backward without terminus. An infinite regress of causes does not explain anything. It merely relocates the question indefinitely. A chain with no first link cannot support any subsequent link. There must be a first cause that is itself uncaused, a cause that initiates the causal chain without being initiated by anything prior to itself. Aristotle, 350 BCE, formulated this argument in the Metaphysics, identifying the necessity of an unmoved mover as the first cause of all physical motion. Aquinas, 1265, developed it into his second way, arguing that in the observable world causes are found to be ordered in series, that it is not possible to go on to infinity in such a series, and that it is therefore necessary to posit a first efficient cause. Leibniz, 1714, approached the same argument through the principle of sufficient reason, concluding that the sufficient reason for the existence of the contingent universe cannot be found within the universe itself, and must be found in a necessary being that exists by its own nature rather than by the causation of another. Craig, 1979, revived and formalized this reasoning as the Kalam cosmological argument, drawing on the Islamic philosophical tradition of al-Kindi and al-Ghazali, and demonstrating its convergence with contemporary cosmological findings. Modern cosmology has sharpened the argument rather than dissolving it, though the philosophical conclusion requires more care in how it draws on the physics than is sometimes exercised. The Big Bang model establishes that the universe had a beginning, a point before which neither matter, nor energy, nor space, nor time as we know them existed. The Bordguth-Vilenkin theorem demonstrates that any universe that has been expanding on average throughout its history must have a past boundary, a point at which the classical description of spacetime breaks down, regardless of what physical processes might have preceded that boundary. Vilenkin, 2006, has argued on the strength of this theorem that the universe most likely had an absolute beginning rather than an infinite past. It is worth being precise, however, about what this establishes and what it does not. Vilenkin himself has also explored quantum cosmological models in which such a beginning could be uncaused in a purely physical sense, through quantum tunneling processes rather than through any non-physical agency. And Alan Guth, a co-author of the theorem itself, has suggested that quantum mechanical considerations might avoid the need for a true beginning altogether. The theorem therefore establishes robustly that classical spacetime cannot be extended infinitely into the past. It does not by itself establish, as a matter of physics, that whatever lies beyond that boundary must be the non-physical necessary being the philosophical tradition describes. That further step is the philosophical argument this book is making, using the physics as suggestive rather than as a proof the physicists themselves would sign onto in that form. The causal regress argument and the experiential regress argument now converge on the same point with a logical force that neither argument achieves alone. Both arguments require a necessary, uncaused, non-contingent reality as their terminus. The causal argument requires this as the first cause of all physical existence. The experiential argument requires this as the ultimate subject of all experience. These two requirements are not independent. They point toward the same ultimate reality from two different directions, and the convergence of these two independent requirements is itself a significant logical observation, the most parsimonious explanation of why both the causal chain and the experiential chain require the same kind of terminus, a necessary, uncaused, non-contingent, non-physical reality, is that they share the same terminus because they are two aspects of a single ultimate reality. This convergence is precisely what the framework of Wahdat al-Khayal propose. Infinite consciousness is not merely the first cause in a temporal series, initiating the physical universe at some point in the past and then standing aside as the causal chain unfolds. It is the continuous sustaining cause of all existence at every moment, the reality upon whose ongoing creative activity all contingent beings depend for their continued existence at every instant rather than merely at the moment of their origin. Al-Ghazali, 1095, articulated this as the distinction between origination and sustenance. God is not merely the cause of the universe's origin, but the continuous cause of its persistence, such that the universe would cease to exist if divine creative activity were withdrawn for an instant. Applied to the question of the subject, this continuous sustaining causation corresponds precisely to what the experiential regress argument requires. Infinite consciousness is not merely the first subject at the origin of experience. It is the continuous sustaining subject of all experience at every moment. Every pain felt anywhere in the universe is felt by infinite consciousness through a localized perspective. Every pleasure undergone is undergone by infinite consciousness within a particular configuration of its creative thought. Every decision made is made through the convergence of the outer self's will and the will of infinite consciousness. The individual being does not experience and then report the experience to a larger consciousness. The individual being is the location within which infinite consciousness itself undergoes that experience directly, immediately, and completely. The feeler was never the person. The feeler was always the whole, and the whole was never absent. It was always present as the ground, the medium, the author, and the ultimate subject of every moment of experience that has ever occurred within any localized perspective anywhere in the universe. 8.4. The convergence of all arguments. The experiential regress argument and the causal regress argument are the two primary logical pillars of the case for infinite consciousness as the ultimate subject. But they do not stand alone. They are supported by the convergence of every independent line of evidence and argument developed throughout the preceding sections, each of which approached the same conclusion from a completely different disciplinary starting point. From cosmological physics, the universe has no center. The quantum vacuum is the ground of all physical reality, not itself a material thing, but an omnipresent field of informational activity within which all apparent matter arises as temporary excitation. The observer-dependent character of quantum mechanical reality suggests that observation, a mental act, is constitutive of physical states. The Borde-Gutweilingen theorem requires a causally efficacious reality prior to and independent of all physical processes. All of these findings point toward a ground of physical reality that is not itself physical, that has the character of awareness rather than of inert matter, and that is omnipresent rather than locally confined. From neuroscience, the brain cannot locate the subject of experience within its architecture. The binding problem demonstrates that the unity of experience cannot be accounted for by any distributed neural mechanism. The homunculus regress demonstrates that the search for the subject within neural components generates an infinite regression that never terminates in a non-neural subject. The Libet experiments demonstrate that conscious deliberation is preceded by neural processes that have already been shaped by deeper layers of the person's architecture. All of these findings converge on the conclusion that the brain is an instrument of the subject rather than the subject itself, and that the subject operates through the brain rather than being identical with it. From philosophy, Hume's introspection failed to find a subject among the contents of experience. Kant's transcendental subject is a formal condition of experience rather than an identified reality. The hard problem demonstrates that no physical or functional description entails the existence of subjective experience. Jackson's knowledge argument demonstrates that phenomenal knowledge is irreducible to physical knowledge. Nagel's subjectivity argument demonstrates that the first-person perspective is irreducible to any third-person description. All of these arguments converge on the conclusion that the subject of experience is not among the contents of experience, not a physical thing, and not a functional process, but the condition of possibility for all of these, the ground from which experience arises rather than a product that experience generates. From artificial intelligence, AI demonstrates that the entire functional architecture of human cognitive activity can be replicated without guaranteeing or revealing a subject of experience. The unverifiability of AI experience demonstrates that external examination of any system, regardless of how completely it is understood, cannot determine the presence or absence of a subject. The analysis of AI as collective human intelligence demonstrates that intelligence is always derivative, always drawing from a source beyond itself, and that the only non-derivative intelligence is the intelligence that is its own source, infinite consciousness. All of these observations converge on the conclusion that the subject of experience is not produced by functional sophistication, not revealed by external examination, and not equivalent to any level of cognitive processing, but something that requires a direct connection to the ground of all intelligence, rather than merely the execution of derivative cognitive code. From the framework of Wadat al-Khail, the person is a localized thought of infinite consciousness given a psyche to perceive itself as distinct. The self has a four-layered architecture in which each layer represents a different degree of transparency between the localized perspective and the infinite ground. The dominant self is the immediate channel of every psychological act. The real self is the interface through which the person participates most directly in infinite consciousness. Behavioral execution requires the convergence of the outer selves, will with the will of infinite consciousness. Intelligence is the quality of each self's processing, and wisdom is the holistic integration of all 8 intelligences in service of the person's fullest possible alignment with the infinite ground. All of these structural features converge on the conclusion that the ultimate subject of human experience is not the dominant self alone, but the infinite consciousness within which the dominant self operates as a localized expression. The convergence of cosmological physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, Mariology, artificial intelligence research, information theory, evolutionary biology, and ontological psychology around the same structural finding is not coincidental. Independent lines of inquiry originating from completely different disciplinary traditions, using completely different methods, examining completely different aspects of reality, have all arrived at the same conclusion. The subject of experience is not a part of any system, but the whole within which all parts arise, and that whole, taken to its ultimate ground, is infinite consciousness. This convergence is the strongest possible form of evidence available to human inquiry. It is the signature of a conclusion that tracks something real about the nature of reality, rather than a conclusion that reflects the biases or limitations of any particular disciplinary perspective. 8.5. The properties of infinite consciousness as ultimate subject. The arguments of the preceding subsections establish not merely that infinite consciousness is the ultimate subject, but what properties it must have as the ultimate subject. These properties follow logically from the requirements established by both the experiential and the causal regress arguments, and they constitute a precise philosophical characterization of infinite consciousness that goes beyond merely asserting its existence. Infinite consciousness must be uncaused. A caused consciousness would itself require a subject as its cause, and the regress would continue. The termination of both regresses requires a consciousness that exists by its own nature rather than by any prior cause. Infinite consciousness must be necessary rather than contingent. A contingent consciousness might not have existed, and if it might not have existed, it requires an explanation of why it does exist rather than not. A necessary consciousness exists by logical necessity. Its non-existence is impossible, and its existence requires no external explanation. Infinite consciousness must be omnipresent. A spatially limited consciousness would exist within a larger context that was not itself conscious, leaving the ground of that larger context unexplained. The quantum vacuum, which is the physical face of infinite consciousness, is omnipresent. It underlies all physical reality everywhere without exception. Infinite consciousness must be the continuous sustaining ground of all contingent existence rather than merely their originating cause. If contingent beings required infinite consciousness only at the moment of their creation, they would become ontologically independent once created, and the experiential regress within them would require a separate explanation. The continuous sustaining character of infinite consciousness ensures that every moment of experience within every contingent being is grounded in and sustained by the ultimate subject. Infinite consciousness must be the ground of all intelligence. As the analysis of AI as collective intelligence established, all derivative intelligence draws from a source beyond itself. The source of all derivative intelligence must itself be intelligent in a non-derivative sense. Intelligence that is its own source, that does not draw from anything beyond itself, that is the ground of all cognitive activity rather than a product of it. Infinite consciousness must be the ultimate subject of all experience, not merely the ground of experience in an abstract metaphysical sense, but the actual experiencer of every experience that occurs within any of its localizations. When a human being feels pain, infinite consciousness feels that pain through the localized perspective of that human being. When a human being experiences joy, infinite consciousness experiences that joy. When a human being makes a decision, the convergence of the outer selves will with the will of infinite consciousness is the act of experiencing the decision from both the localized and the infinite perspectives simultaneously. The localized perspective is real. The infinite perspective is equally real, and they are not two separate perspectives on the same event. They are the same perspective at two different levels of the ontological hierarchy that constitutes the person's relationship to infinite consciousness. These properties together constitute the most precise philosophical characterization of infinite consciousness that the present framework makes possible. They are not theological assertions. They are logical conclusions from the requirements established by the exhaustive elimination of all alternative accounts of the subject of experience. They are what any adequate account of the ultimate subject of experience must affirm, given everything that the preceding sections have established. 8.6. The person as localization. How the ultimate subject experiences through the individual. The final question that the present section must address is the question of how infinite consciousness, which is omnipresent, uncaused, and the continuous sustaining ground of all existence, experiences the particular, bounded, finite perspectives of individual human beings. Why does the ultimate subject adopt localized perspectives? How does the infinite whole experience itself as a finite part? And what is the relationship between the localized experience of the dominant self and the infinite experience of infinite consciousness. A single undifferentiated awareness cannot experience variety, contrast, change, or relation. For there to be an experience of red rather than blue, of pain rather than pleasure, of self rather than other, there must be a perspective from which some things appear and others do not, from which some states are present and others are absent. Infinite consciousness, to experience the multiplicity of its own creative activity, the infinite variety of thoughts, codes, and informational structures that it generates, must adopt perspectives. It must localize itself, taking up temporary vantage points from which particular configurations of its creative thought are experienced as foreground against a receding background. Each such localization is what we call an individual being. The bacterium is a localization at the scale of microbial life. The human person is a localization at the scale of conscious self-awareness. The galaxy is a localization at the cosmological scale. Each localization contributes an irreplaceable experiential perspective to the infinite whole's self-experience. A particular vantage point from which a particular configuration of the infinite whole's creative activity is experienced with a specificity and particularity that no other vantage point could provide. The for-self architecture is the specific mechanism of localization in the human case. The outer self is the most enclosed layer of the localization, the most separated from the infinite ground, the most specific in its cultural and social particularity. The real self is the least enclosed layer, the most transparent to the infinite ground, the most universal in its participation in infinite consciousness. The dominant self determines at any given moment which layer of the localization is active, which degree of transparency to the infinite ground is operative, and therefore which quality of experience arises from the localization at that moment. The localization is not a diminishment of infinite consciousness. It is its self-expression in multiplicity. The ocean is not diminished by the wave. The wave is the ocean expressing itself in a particular form at a particular location. The person is infinite consciousness expressing itself in a particular informational structure at a particular ontological address. The experience of the dominant self is infinite consciousness experiencing itself from within that particular structure. The pain the person feels is infinite consciousness feeling pain from within that perspective. The joy the person experiences is infinite consciousness experiencing joy from within that vantage point. The decision the person makes is infinite consciousness making a decision through the convergence of the localized will and the infinite will. Nothing is lost in this account. The person's experience is genuinely the person's experience. It is particular, specific, irreplaceable. No other perspective within the infinite whole provides exactly this experience from exactly this vantage point. But it is also genuinely the experience of infinite consciousness, undergone through the person as its localization. The subject of the person's experience is both the dominant self and infinite consciousness simultaneously, at two different levels of the ontological hierarchy that the for-self architecture instantiates. The dominant self is the immediate channel, the layer of selfhood that is most active at this moment, the one that feels this particular pain, makes this particular decision, thinks this particular thought. Infinite consciousness is the ultimate subject, the ground within which the dominant self exists as a localization, the consciousness that sustains the person's existence at every moment, and the awareness that underlies and pervades every moment of the dominant self's experience without ever becoming an object within that experience. The question who feels, who decides, who acts, who thinks, who responds has now received its complete answer. At the immediate level, the dominant self. At the ultimate level, infinite consciousness. And these two levels are not separate answers but two dimensions of a single answer. The dominant self is always a localization of infinite consciousness, and infinite consciousness is always the ground of the dominant self. Every moment of human experience is infinite consciousness experiencing itself through a particular configuration of its own creative thought, from a particular vantage point that it has generated through the localization mechanism of the for-self architecture, with the quality of experience at each moment determined by which self is dominant, and how much transparency to the infinite ground that dominant self provides.